a man who authorities say sexually assaulted and killed a 20-year-old woman 3 decades ago, has been identified. The Wichita Police Department named Paul Hart, who died in a traffic collision in 1999, a suspect in the 1989 death of Krista Martin. On October 2, 1989, tragedy struck when Krista Martin was discovered deceased in a residence in the 500 block of South Osage. Although DNA evidence was collected at the time of the incident, testing was not available. It was, nonetheless, carefully preserved. Investigators were unable to identify a suspect at the time, despite conducting numerous interviews. But they continued to scrutinize the evidence, gather leads over the years, and collect DNA from multiple individuals for comparison with the evidence from the scene. Yet no match was found, according to police. The case detective sent evidence to the Federal Bureau of Investigation between 1990 and 1992 in hopes of identifying a suspect. But the effort yielded no results, and the case was left unsolved. Although another attempt in 2009 to identify a suspect through the DNA evidence proved unsuccessful, the police department tried again in 2020. In 2020, the Wichita Police Department, leveraging advanced technology again, sought the assistance of the FBI to re-evaluate the DNA evidence collected in 1989. After homicide detectives and federal authorities continued with their investigation through 2021 and 2022, they collaborated with private industry genealogists to scrutinize DNA profiles and attempt to identify a suspect. Finally, in April 2023, a possible suspect, Paul Hart, emerged. It was discovered that Hart died in a traffic collision in Memphis, Tennessee, in March of 1999. So law enforcement collected DNA samples from Hart's direct relatives and through additional testing confirmed that Hart was the suspect in the 1989 homicide of Martin. Detective Adam Vandermolen told CNN that while Martin's DNA was recovered from a sexual assault kit that was collected back at the time, police were only able to determine that she died by blunt force trauma, a blow to the side of her head. "There was never a murder weapon found that we know of," he said in an interview. "We don't know what was used. This was a long road." Police can't say for sure how Hart and Martin might have met, although Vandermolen told CNN that Krista and Paul lived about 6 houses from one another at the time of the murder. Vandermolen added that through talking to Krista's family, Paul's family, his girlfriend at the time, and Krista's writings, we have not been able to find a true connection between them. But some patterns about how Martin lived did emerge, which may point to how spent her final hours. What we did learn was that Krista was a very outgoing individual that frequented local drinking establishments and befriended people she encountered, Vandermolen told CNN. It was not uncommon for Krista to get rides home from people she had recently met and invited them to her apartment. He also said there was no forced entry at her home on the night of her death. When the police presented the facts of the case to Sedgwick County District Attorney Mark Bennett, it was determined that charges would be filed if Mr. Hart were still alive. As he is deceased, this case is now considered cleared. Michelle Wyatt from California was the type of young woman everyone wants as a friend. The athletic student was 20 in 1980 and enjoyed scuba diving and tap dancing, and she was trying to decide whether to pursue a career in oceanography or telecommunications. However, she also worked as a Safeway cashier to pay her way through her studies and taught kids how to dance and play musical instruments. It's coming up on 41 years since neighbors in Michelle Wyatt's condo in the San Diego County town of Santee heard screams, and since her roommate came home the next day and made a horrifying discovery. The 20-year-old college student was dead. She'd been raped and strangled. For 4 decades, the deadly attack confounded every investigator who picked up the file. Years later, DNA seemed like it could help. But time and again, it didn't. until one day in 2021 when that changed. Investigative genetic genealogy finally identified Michelle's killer as a former neighbor named John Patrick Hogan. But there was no arrest, no trial, and no conviction because Hogan had died 17 years earlier, ironically on the very same day of the year, October 9th. Brian Patterson, who just retired after more than 26 years with the Sheriff's Department, the last 11 in homicide, led the team of detectives that solved the case. It had been a cold case for years. During the initial investigation, 38 suspects had been interrogated and ultimately cleared, many years later when their DNA was found not to match the killer's, which had been found in Wyatt's body. The case had been assigned to another detective, Patterson said, who had had no luck. Then, little over 2 years ago, Patterson was asked by a deputy district attorney with whom he was working on another case if he'd like to take another look. After reading up on the case, he agreed to take it on. "Both I and the DA grew up in Santee," Patterson said. "So I just took an interest in it, and when I read through the case, there were people in there I knew. So it was just kind of interesting. And everything had been done for the most part. They had eliminated nearly 40 people through DNA, and the main people they thought had done it were eliminated through DNA. So there wasn't a whole lot to do on it. But then when genetic genealogy came about, that kind of opened the door." Michelle Wyatt and Patrick Hogan's paths crossed on the night of October 9th, 1980, just a few days after Hogan had gotten back into San Diego from New Mexico. In January 1980, Wyatt's father had let her and a roommate move into a condo he owned at 10586 Kerrigan Court in Santee. Michelle was ecstatic, as much as she loved her dad, her mom, and her little brother, Ray J. She was excited to be on her own. Patterson, Hogan's connection to Michelle, we think. Is that because he had lived in that complex? He knew people in that complex. He knew a guy who lived cater corner from Michelle, and that guy used to play pool with her in her garage because she had a pool table. So when I spoke to him, he goes, "Yeah, I know her and we saw her, and I wanted to date her. But I was kind of scared because she's an attractive lady." And then I brought up Patrick Hogan, and he's talking, and then all of a sudden it hits him why I brought up his name. And he goes, "Oh, are you telling me he did it?" I told him it looks like he might have. And he says, "Well, of all the people I know, that's the guy who could do something like that." But nobody ever asked about him. On the evening of Wednesday, October 8th, Michelle left the Sue Hamilton School of Dance on El Cajon Boulevard, where she had been taking tap dancing lessons 3 nights a week since she was 7, and drove home. There she was met by her boyfriend of 4 months, Patrick Acombe, who had just completed his last class of the day at Mesa College. The two had met the previous spring at the Safeway store where Michelle was working as a cashier. Acombe, who at the time lived nearby, had started paying her regular visits before finally asking her out for a date in July. They began seeing each other regularly and grew quite close. Just a few days before she was murdered, when her mother half-jokingly asked, "Hey, Michelle, are you getting married?" Michelle rolled her eyes and, giggling, said, "Oh, Mom, you're embarrassing me, but yes, I finally found the right one." Shortly after Acombe's arrival, he and Michelle retreated to the condo's garage, where they played 3 games of pool while talking about what each had done that day. Michelle had attended only 2 of her classes that morning, opting, instead of attending a 3rd, to go running with her boyfriend before dance class, and she was fatigued. Still, she managed to beat Acombe in all 3 pool games, and on their way out of the garage, she kidded him about her victories. After turning out the garage lights, they went back inside the condo through the sliding glass doors in the dining room and sat down in the living room to watch television. Acombe doesn't recall whether they had locked the glass doors after their entry, and the question has repeatedly bothered him since. What he does remember clearly is that he left through the front door shortly before 1 the following morning, instructing Michelle, as he always did, to lock the door behind him. That was the last time anyone saw Michelle Wyatt alive. Less than an hour later, a neighbor reported hearing Michelle's 2 collies barking furiously, accompanied by some yelling, but they didn't investigate. Just before 5 the next afternoon, Michelle's roommate, who asked her name not be used, returned home from an overnight excursion and parked her car along the Carrigan Court curb. She had moved in with Michelle the previous July. The glare of the late afternoon sun was blinding to the roommate as she walked past the 2 rows of condos onto the strip of grass leading to her own front door. As she approached the condo, what she saw filled her with instant apprehension. "I knew something had to be wrong because the lights were still on and the curtains were drawn," the roommate recalled later. Michelle always got up early, and she would never leave the house shut up like that. "As I walked up to the front door, I remember thinking, this is weird, because the mail was still in the mailbox and the newspaper was on the ground outside the door. Then I opened the door and I saw her right away, and I knew immediately. I don't know how, I just knew. Instinct, maybe. You just know. I dropped everything I had in my hands. I dropped the newspaper, the mail, some books I had borrowed from a friend, and ran to a neighbor's apartment across the lawn, all the while thinking I must be dreaming. I called the police and then Mrs. Wyatt. I waited for the police outside the front door of the apartment I had run to. I wasn't sure this had really happened, and I figured the police would tell me if it was true, if Michelle was really dead. When they told me, I just couldn't believe it. All I could say over and over was, oh my God, oh my God. When police arrived at the Santee condominium in response to the roommate's phone call, they found Wyatt's lifeless body just inside the front door. Her purse and its contents had been dumped out into the toilet. They collected evidence, dusted for fingerprints, and took lots of photos. The body was taken to the San Diego County Medical Examiner's office, where an autopsy determined that Wyatt had died of asphyxiation after having been strangled with a telephone cord. She had also been sexually assaulted, and seminal fluid was recovered, according to the news release. After the murder, Hogan returned to New Mexico. Very little is known of his later life, except that he got divorced, married a second time, had a second child, and died of a methamphetamine overdose on October 9, 2004, 24 years to the day after he murdered Wyatt. At the time of his death, he was 42. The detective thinks this is what happened on that fateful night of October 9, 1980, when John Patrick Hogan murdered Michelle Wyatt. Well, there was no forced entry. So one of 2 things, he says. She recognized him banging on the door. She looked and said, "Oh, I know this guy." Not a big deal. Maybe he needed something. Maybe he was asking for something. She lets him in. Or her boyfriend had just left, and she thought he was coming back, so she opened the door. Maybe he was watching. Maybe he watched the boyfriend leave. Who knows? And then she maybe thought that was the boyfriend coming right back and just opened the door, not thinking because people said she wouldn't have opened that door for a stranger at 12:30, 12:45 at night. The assault happened right there, probably in the living room. I don't think it went anywhere else. And then everything he used to kill her was right there. Patterson says all of Hogan's relatives are resigned to the fact that he killed Wyatt, except for his first wife, the high school sweetheart and mother of his oldest daughter. She suggested the 2 had consensual sex, and then he left and someone else killed her. Patterson considers such a scenario highly unlikely. She's, really grasping. She doesn't want to admit that her high school sweetheart was a killer. Wyatt's parents are grateful for the detectives who kept the investigation going over 40 years. "I wish there is something I could do for them," Louise Wyatt said. "A hug and a thank you doesn't seem like enough." a California tech company executive, has been charged in the 1992 murder of his former roommate's girlfriend. John Kevin Woodward, the president and CEO of ReadyTech, was charged with the murder of Laurie Houts, a 25-year-old computer engineer who was found strangled in her car in Mountain View, the Santa Clara County office of the district attorney stated. Woodward, now 58, was arrested in July 2022 at John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York after arriving from Amsterdam. Officials said Houts was discovered dead in her vehicle near a garbage dump about a mile from her work. The rope used to kill her was still around her neck, and her footprints were visible on the interior of the car's windshield, a sign of her struggle with the suspect. Her pocketbook was found nearby, undisturbed. Woodward, who was roommates with Houts' boyfriend, was arrested later that same year in connection with the homicide. The Santa Clara County District Attorney's Office said Woodward was openly jealous of Houts and had developed an unrequited romantic attachment to his roommate, and had no alibi for the night Houts was killed. When the boyfriend asked Woodward if he killed her as police listened in, Woodward asked what the investigators knew. Although Woodward's fingerprints were located on the outside of Houts' car, investigators in 1992 were never able to show he was inside the vehicle. He was tried twice for the crime. The first trial resulted in a hung jury, and a second trial, roughly a year later, also resulted in a hung jury. In the second trial, the trial judge noted that new evidence would need to be brought forward to retry Woodward again. Woodward relocated after the second trial to the Netherlands, where he currently resides. Thanks to updates in DNA technology, police were able to connect Woodward to the rope used in the crime with additional evidence. Beginning in late 2020, detectives started to re-examine the Houts case, resubmitting items from the investigation to the Santa Clara County Crime Lab for renewed analysis. Police said DNA samples collected from evidence at the scene came back matching Woodward's DNA. Additionally, over 80 latent fingerprints that were also collected at the time of Laurie's death were re-examined by the Santa Clara County Sheriff's Identification Unit, which resulted in even more fingerprints matching Woodward. The new information, along with evidence that led to Woodward being charged and tried as the primary suspect during the original investigation, led the Santa Clara County District Attorney's Office to issue a new warrant for Woodward's arrest for murder. This case is the culmination of incredible determination by our detectives over the decades, and with phenomenal teamwork with our agency partners here in Santa Clara County and in New York, said Mountain View Police Chief Chris Young in a statement. I am honored that our agency finally gets to give hope to Laurie's family that they can see a successful prosecution carried out. It bears repeating, we do not give up on justice for victims, no matter what. Woodward is being held in New York without bail until he can be extradited back to California. He faces life in prison if convicted. District Attorney Jeff Rosen praised the cooperation and assistance from the U.S. Department of Justice and the Dutch Ministry of Justice and Security. Dutch authorities coordinated with the DOJ, obtaining a warrant for the search of Woodward's home and business in the Netherlands in less than 24 hours, seizing multiple computers and USB drives, he said. Growing up, Richard Hanchett heard stories about his biological mother, how beautiful she was, with red hair and blue eyes, and how much she loved singing. Just a really nice person, Mr. Hanchett, 64 said. But he never met Ruth Marie Terry. She chose to have him adopted right after he was born in 1958, entrusting him to a couple who worked with her at a plant that made door panels and seat covers for cars in Livonia, Michigan. She was 21 at the time. In 2018, hoping to find her, Mr. Hanchett, who lives in Waterford, Michigan, took a DNA test through Ancestry.com and met her family in Tennessee. That's when he learned that she had been missing since the early 1970s and that her relatives there had been searching for her for decades. On Monday, October 31st, 2022, the family finally learned what had happened to her when the FBI announced that a badly mutilated body found nearly 50 years ago in the dunes of Provincetown, Massachusetts, was that of Mrs. Terry, who was 37 and originally from Tennessee. On Wednesday, November 2nd, 2022, the authorities announced a new development in the investigation, saying that they were seeking information about a man, now deceased, named Guy Rockwell Moldovan, who Miss Terry was believed to have married shortly before she was murdered. Mr. Moldovan, born in 1923, was a former antiques dealer who was arrested in 1960 in connection with the disappearance of his former wife and her daughter after mutilated remains, believed to be theirs, were found in their Seattle home. Mr. Moldovan was given a suspended sentence in the case and was freed in 1962. Court records indicate that Mr. Moldovan married Mrs. Terry in Reno, Nevada, in February 1974, just months before she was killed. Mrs. Terry's nephew, Jim Terry, said that the last time he had seen Mrs. Terry was in July or August of 1973, in a motel room with Mr. Moldovan in Chattanooga, Tennessee. His mother thought she was going to California, and his father thought she was headed up north, Mr. Terry said. "We never heard from her again," said Mr. Terry, 60, adding, "I was a kid. I just remember a big smile and her auburn hair." Mrs. Terry's family later learned about Mr. Moldovan's connection to the disappearance of his wife and her daughter in Seattle. "It sure gave me the chills when I read that," Mr. Hanchett said. Then, at the request of investigators, he submitted a DNA sample to confirm that the body found in Provincetown was that of his biological mother. Mrs. Terry's nude body was found on a beach blanket on Race Point Beach on July 26, 1974, by a girl who was hiking with her family. Mrs. Terry's hands were missing, presumably removed by her killer so she could not be identified with fingerprints, and her nearly severed head rested on folded jeans, the FBI said. Investigators said she had been killed by a blow to the head, probably several weeks earlier. Detectives canvassed motels and rooming houses, reviewed thousands of reports of missing women, checked every vehicle licensed to drive on the dunes, and used clay models to recreate what she might have looked like. But they were unable to identify the woman they called the Lady of the Dunes, and her case haunted a generation of investigators and Cape Cod residents. She was said by the FBI to have been the oldest unidentified homicide victim in Massachusetts. As the trail went cold, some speculated that she had been killed by the notorious South Boston gangster, James Whitey Bulger. The writer Joe Hill, a son of Stephen King, believed she might have been an extra from the movie Jaws, which was filmed on nearby Martha's Vineyard that year. In 2000, the authorities exhumed her remains from a cemetery in Provincetown to extract a DNA sample. But it wasn't until recently that they were able to identify her through genetic genealogy, the same technique that was used to identify the Golden State Killer, among many others. At a news conference, law enforcement officials said they were now turning their attention to finding Mrs. Terry's killer by tracing her history and asking the public for tips. They did not mention Mr. Moldovan. He died in 2002 at age 78 in Salinas, California, according to an obituary in the Monterey County Herald. "It's very likely that the person who did this is dead," Michael D. O'Keefe, the district attorney for Cape Cod, Nantucket, and Martha's Vineyard, stated. "But they may not be, and so the message to them, if they're still out there, is, we're coming." Mrs. Terry grew up in Whitwell, Tennessee, about 24 miles northwest of Chattanooga, and left home when she was a teenager, Mr. Terry said. By the time she reached Livonia, Michigan, she had been married once and separated, and was known as Ruth Smith. Mr. Hanchett said, "She lived in California in the 1960s, Mr. Terry said, and then returned to Tennessee. Mr. O'Keefe said there was no information to suggest that Mrs. Terry had ever been reported to the authorities as a missing person. But Mr. Terry said that his sister, Marilyn Renee Hill, who died in 2021, had used genealogical websites and DNA tests to conduct her own investigation. "My sister was kind of hell-bent on trying to find her," he said, even in the later years. Mr. Hanchett, a retired software engineer for General Motors, said that he had helped Miss Hill searching online for names and addresses she would give him. Mr. Hanchett said that Mrs. Terry had tried to contact him once when he was about 13, but he rejected her overture, which he deeply regrets. He said he hoped to have her reburied next to her parents in Tennessee. "Everybody that I talked to who knew her adored her," he said. "I wish I could have just talked to her, touched her once." For decades, the murder of a 30-year-old woman whose body was found along I-10 in the middle of the desert went unsolved. But advances in DNA technology have allowed some semblance of closure for Sherri Herrera's 4 children, with news of an arrest of a man believed to be the murder suspect. "I don't know if I really believed it, because it's like, man, this has been so long," said the victim's son, Adrian Herrera, who found out about the break in the case last week. Herrera was only 6 years old on March 30th, 1993. That's the day the body of his mother was found dumped at the I-10 exit of Hayfield Road near Desert Center. It's a day Herrera said he'll never forget. "I remember coming home from school, and my stepmom told us the news what had happened," he said. "Me and my sister were there. Obviously, we started bawling our eyes out." Sherri Herrera was from Tulare County in the Central Valley. So how did her body end up alongside a freeway in the Southern California desert, about halfway between Palm Springs and the Arizona state line? That remained a mystery to investigators. The case was investigated by local authorities, and then relatively soon after that, it went cold, said Riverside County District Attorney Mike Hestrin. "We had no suspects." In the early 1990s, the processing and testing of DNA evidence was still in its infancy. But Hestrin said because investigators were so diligent in processing the scene, it allowed their cold case unit the opportunity to reopen the murder investigation about a year ago. Investigators in this case did a good job. They collected, processed, packaged, and sealed the evidence. And in a box it went, he said. "Our cold case unit eventually goes back and opens up these old cases and old boxes and starts looking." Hestrin didn't specifically address what they found that allowed them to crack the case, but said potential DNA evidence from the murderer found at the crime scene matched DNA evidence found at another murder crime scene in the state of Texas. That murder was committed in 1992. "Our cold case unit assisted Texas authorities in their case," said Hestrin. "The results of that are, that person is also a person of interest in the Riverside County investigation into the murder of Sherri Herrera. The suspect in the Texas murder case and person of interest in the Herrera case has been identified as 68-year-old Douglas Thomas. At the time of the murders, Hestrin said he was a long-haul truck driver. Now retired, Texas authorities said he was arrested on suspicion of murder at his home in Waco last week. Adrian Herrera said investigators told him that the DNA match that led authorities to Thomas didn't come from Thomas himself. It was a family member, or maybe one of his kids or a cousin, and then they traced it backwards, said Herrera. I mean, without this technology being available, this guy would still be sitting behind his TV and enjoying whatever life he had left. Herrera was allegedly killed during the commission of a rape. According to prosecutors, potential DNA from the killer discovered at Herrera's crime scene matched DNA found at the Titus County murder scene. Authorities said Thomas will be prosecuted in Texas first, and then Riverside prosecutors will request that he be extradited back to California to face his charges in Herrera's murder. Anyone with information about the case is asked to contact the Riverside County Regional Cold Case Homicide Team at 951-955-2777. After more than 3 decades of questions and grief, Tamika Reyes finally knows who killed her mother. She was 9 when her mother was killed. Anna Kane was 26 when her body was found on October 23, 1988, in a wooded area near Reading, Pennsylvania, with baling twine around her neck. An investigation revealed she'd been strangled elsewhere and dumped in the woods. A local newspaper, the Reading Eagle, ran a front-page story seeking information on Kane's death. In February 1990, about 15 months after she was killed, the paper received an anonymous letter from a concerned citizen with information that only the killer would know, police said. The letter writer also left his DNA when he licked the envelope. The DNA from the saliva matched what was found on Kane's clothing, authorities said in August 2022. But years turned into decades, and police still didn't know who the suspect was. Finally, in 2022, Pennsylvania State Police used genetic genealogy testing to identify the killer. A local man named Scott Grimm, law enforcement officers said at a news conference. Now Reyes finally has some answers, although she's sad for her grandmother, who died before learning the case was solved. I felt a little bit of everything when I found out, she stated. I was happy to finally put a face behind the monster who took her from us, and upset that he will never be able to face consequences. For 34 years, Reyes, along with her 2 brothers and their grandmother, have wondered who killed Kane. The lack of closure has added to the distress of losing their mother, she said. Then Reyes got a call in August of 2022 from a detective about a stunning development in the case. After years of waiting for justice, she was relieved investigators finally had named her mother's killer. But she was disappointed to learn that Grimm had died in 2018 of natural causes, at age 58, and will not pay for robbing her and her siblings of a childhood with a mother. Reyes was 9 when her mother was killed, and said she thinks about her every day. She was a firecracker, very outgoing, not afraid of anything, very honest, blunt, and caring. Reyes said one of her fondest childhood memories was taking walks with her mother and seeing her suddenly dance to random music playing in stores as they passed. After her death, Reyes' aunt took her in and raised her while her 2 brothers moved in with their father. Reyes said she's still bothered by the image the media painted of her mother, who was unemployed at the time of her death. Although her mother had a dark past that included drug use and prostitution, she was trying to turn her life around. She was portrayed as this slain prostitute, like she deserved what happened to her, said Reyes, 43, who lives in Lenhartsville, Pennsylvania. It was hurtful. She was more than that. She was a victim. She was a mother. She was loved. No one deserves what happened to her. Investigators used breakthrough technology to crack the case. Investigators said they identified Grimm as the killer using genetic genealogy, which combines DNA evidence and traditional genealogy to find biological connections among people. In recent years, companies like 23andMe and Ancestry have encouraged people to explore their genealogy by spitting into a tube and sending it off for analysis. These companies then send back information on their clients' ethnic heritage, genetic health risks, and family tree, as well as a raw data file of their DNA. With millions of users seeking to explore their genetic roots, the practice has become a big business. It's also become a valuable tool for law enforcement officers trying to solve old crimes. DNA collected from crime scenes can now be uploaded to an online service that compares it to DNA submitted by people using companies like 23andMe to explore their genealogy. If a possible match is found, genealogists can build out family trees to help police find potential suspects. Investigators analyzed Kane's clothing and found traces of an unknown man's DNA. They later determined that it matched the DNA on the envelope from 1990, confirming investigators' belief that the person behind the letter was the killer. But while investigators had Grimm's DNA profile, There was nothing to identify him because he had never been arrested for anything that required his DNA to be put into the system, authorities said. That's where genetic genealogy came in. Genetic genealogy's effectiveness in cold cases depends on the quality of crime scene DNA and whether it has degraded, State Police Trooper Daniel Wommer said at a news conference in 2022. The detective's careful preservation of DNA evidence in 1988 provided a solid foundation for today's investigators to examine with new technology, Pennsylvania State Police Sergeant Nathan Trate said at the news conference. All of that stuff was preserved the way it should be, because they knew probably somewhere down the line whatever they collected could be that little piece of evidence to solve the case, Trate said. Well, here we are in 2022, and that little piece of evidence that they collected was exactly what we needed. Rhea still has questions for her mother's killer. Investigators don't know much about Grimm, other than he lived in the nearby Hamburg, Pennsylvania. They're trying to determine whether he knew Kane and have urged anyone who knows the nature of their relationship to reach out. So far, they've found no ties. But that doesn't mean there wasn't some connection that we haven't figured out yet, Wommer said. Kane was reportedly working as a prostitute at the time she was killed and may have been meeting a customer, Wommer said, adding that police are trying to determine whether it was Grimm. The Pennsylvania State Police have declined to release the 1990 letter to the newspaper or to elaborate on exactly what it said. There was just intimate details about where she was disposed of, how her clothes were displayed. Stuff like that. Wommer said, this led investigators to believe that whoever wrote the letter had committed the homicide. The biggest breakthrough in the case happened after they obtained a new sample of Grimm's DNA to compare with the older evidence. They declined to elaborate how they obtained his DNA when he's been dead for 4 years. It was obtained legally through a search warrant, Trate said. Now that they have identified Grimm's DNA, police will review other open cold cases to see if he was involved, Wommer said. Meanwhile, Rhea still misses her mother. It has been hard growing up without a mom, she said. No child should ever have to grow up without their mom. Rhea still has so many questions she'd ask Grimm if he was still alive. Why did he kill a young woman who was just trying to take care of her children? And what went through his mind when he learned she had a family that loved her? Reyes knows she'll never get the answers, but she's glad her family finally knows her mother's killer.
Asenath Dukat was killed on her way home from school back in 1980. 10 TV's Brittanee Bailey reports on the long wait for answers. It's a case she's been researching for nearly 2 years.
The death of Asenath Dukat here in this Upper Arlington community made an impact that lasted for decades, and now police say her case is finally solved.
We have closed the Dukat murder case.
That was the announcement from Upper Arlington Police on Thursday. More than 40 years after Asenath Dukat was murdered on her way home from school, police are officially naming her accused killer.
After 42 years, Upper Arlington police say they have identified a suspect in the death of 8-year-old Asenath Dukat, whose homicide has been one of the area's most infamous unsolved cases. Upper Arlington police stated that DNA technology advancements have helped them identify Brent Stratner as the suspect in the case. Stratner died by suicide in June 1984 at the age of 24. On June 3, 1980, Dukat left Barrington Elementary School and started the approximately 1-mile walk to her home on Malvern Road, but she never got there. About 4 hours after she was reported missing, Upper Arlington police said Dukat's body was found in a shallow stream at the mouth of a culvert near First Community Village. A 20-pound limestone rock had been used to hit her in the head, police said. Her death, which remained unsolved for more than 4 decades, rocked the Upper Arlington community. Over the years, police identified more than a dozen people as possible suspects for investigation and hypnotized a number of people in attempts to solve the case. In the end, it was DNA that led police to the person they believe was the killer. In 2008, police received information about a DNA profile being recovered from evidence collected in the case that matched Stagner. Detectives then re-examined every other piece of evidence to determine if Stagner acted alone or with anyone else, but found no DNA to implicate anyone else. Around the time of Dukat's death, a number of young females were attacked, including an attempt to abduct a young girl on Henderson Road. That attack, Upper Arlington police said, was only months after Dukat's homicide and was made by a man who associated with Stagner. That man, who served time in prison for the attempted abduction, also was investigated as being involved in Dukat's death. The police division was unable to discover sufficient evidence to also link him to the murder of Asenath, police said. Detectives also re-interviewed a number of witnesses and people of interest to determine if any other evidence would come to light. The division is confident that all investigative leads have been exhausted, police said. We wanted to make sure all the pieces and parts were tied together before we released anything, he said. Stagner was a suspect long before we had the ability to identify him. Police Chief Steve Farmer said the department has worked tirelessly for years to solve the case. This tragic death shook our community in 1980, and the reverberations continue to this day, he said. Our hearts continue to go out to the Dukat family, and we wish them peace as they continue their healing. Members of the Long Walk Home, the Asenath Dukat Project, said in a statement that press release from Upper Arlington only confirmed what they've known and shared through their project since its inception in 2019. The case may be closed by the city of Upper Arlington, but it is far from closed for us, the group said in a statement. We applaud the countless hours and hard work that lead to the confirmation of Brent Stagner's involvement in the crime. However, after viewing the totality of the evidence, it is reasonable to conclude Brent Stagner did not act alone. Our mission will continue based on that belief, and as long as the Dukat family and our community continue to support our efforts to bring all involved to justice. Sergeant McCain said, being able to give the Dukat family answers after more than 4 decades has been bittersweet. To say there's joy in closing, it isn't true, he said. This case is all about sadness. For the officers who worked on it, they'll carry it with them forever. This is one of those cases that haunts you. McCain said the case also spoke to the strength of the community in Upper Arlington. Many residents participated in searches for Dukat when she was reported missing, and have cooperated with the investigation through the years while holding out hope that the case would be solved. Every person involved wanted to get to this point, he said. We hope it brings some little bit of peace to the Dukat family. Leon was 9 years old when her childhood friend was murdered. The two often played jump rope at recess and were in the same Sunday school class at Our Lady of Victory Church in Marble Cliff. Sometimes the girls walked home together, but Leon was already on her way by the time Dukat's class was excused that day. It's still hard to talk about. For most of us who lived through it, there's been so much speculation over the years that it doesn't really bring closure, she said. The hardest part is knowing that Stagner is also dead, because it means there will be no justice. In April 2009, the teen from New York came down to Myrtle Beach for spring break. She was last seen outside the Blue Water Resort on Ocean Boulevard, and then she vanished. It wasn't until 13 years later, when a stunning confession in May 2022 brought closure to a case that haunted the Grand Strand for 13 years. The disappearance of Brittanee Drexel, a man named Raymond Moody, who was once a person of interest in the case, came forward and confessed that he had raped, kidnapped, and killed Drexel the very night that she disappeared. I was a monster. Raymond Moody, 62, a longtime person of interest in the case, said in court, after entering his guilty plea. I was a monster then, and I was a monster when I took Brittanee Drexel's life. I don't have the words to express how horrible I feel. I'm very sorry. The judge sentenced Moody to consecutive terms of 30 years on the charges of kidnapping and criminal sexual conduct, and a life sentence on the first-degree murder charge for kidnapping, raping, and strangling the 17-year-old high school soccer star who dreamed of becoming a nurse or cosmetologist. In his victim statement to the court before Moody was sentenced, Drexel's stepfather, Chad Drexel, who with her mother, Dawn Plecken, searched tirelessly for the teen, said he'd always held out hope that she would be one day found. 13 years later, I find out the horrible and disgusting way she was murdered, he said, choking back tears. Plecken had harsher words for Moody. I hope you suffer in prison for the rest of your useless life, said Plecken, who never stopped looking for her daughter. For more than a decade, Drexel's parents wondered what happened to the outgoing junior at Gates Chili High School in Chili, New York. Unbeknownst to her parents, on April 22, 2009, Drexel joined a group of friends who were going to Myrtle Beach for spring break. I didn't know she was going, Plecken previously stated. The day she left, she was angry with me because she asked me if she could go and I told her no. I said, "There's no adults going, and I have no idea who these kids are and I don't feel comfortable with it." I told her I just felt something was going to happen to her, Plecken said. I just felt it. On April 25, 2009, Drexel left her hotel alone and headed to the Blue Water Resort on Ocean Boulevard, the busy main drag in Myrtle Beach, to visit a friend who was staying there. She was last seen at about 8:45 p.m. when surveillance cameras captured her, leaving the hotel in a black and white tank top, shorts, and flip-flops, say authorities. She texted her boyfriend back home that she was walking back to the Bar Harbor, a motor inn a mile and a half down the road, where she and her friends were staying. She was never heard from again. Her cell phone transmitted its last known signal the day after she disappeared near the South Santee River, between McClellanville and Georgetown, say authorities. For years, local authorities and the FBI searched for her, holding press conferences along the way, asking for the public's help. In May of 2022, her body was finally found buried in the South Carolina woods. Details about what happened to Drexel when she vanished were finally revealed when police arrested Moody that month, after he directed them to the spot where he'd buried her body. The day after Drexel vanished, police in the nearby town of Surfside stopped Moody for speeding. But authorities would not identify him as a potential person of interest in the case for another 2 years. Moody was living an hour from Myrtle Beach, at a motel in Georgetown, South Carolina, in 2009 when Drexel was last seen, investigators said. According to authorities, Moody kidnapped Drexel as she walked alone along the Myrtle Beach Strip. Thanks to advances in cell phone technology, starting in 2019, authorities were able to track Drexel's phone, showing that she went from walking on the strip to traveling in a car and ending up in the Georgetown County area. Assistant Solicitor Scott Hickson explained in court. The case came to a head in April 2022 when Moody's girlfriend, Angel Vaz, agreed to help the FBI and wear a wire and talk to Moody about what happened to Drexel. On May 5, 2022, Moody admitted what he did to Drexel. He told authorities he and Vaz were driving in Myrtle Beach when they saw Drexel and asked her to party with them, Hickson said. He said she got into the car voluntarily, which her family disputed. He said he drove Vaz and Drexel to a campsite in Georgetown County, where they smoked marijuana. When Vaz left, Moody said he wanted to have sex with Drexel. When she refused, he raped her. Worried that he might get in trouble for raping Drexel, he strangled her, wrapped her body in a blanket, and hid her in the woods. He returned to the campsite later on, moved Drexel's body, and buried it in another location. Moody is a registered sex offender who spent 21 years in prison following a 1983 abduction and rape case in California, involving a 9-year-old girl. The guilty plea and sentencing are bittersweet for Drexel's family. I'll never be able to walk Brittanee down the aisle, and neither will her blood father or Dawn, Chad Drexel said. She'll never be able to see my granddaughter, her niece, who is amazing, all that's snatched away from us. On March 29, 1983, a man was walking his dog on the banks of the San Lorenzo River on the 200 block of Woodland Drive in Ben Lomond, California, when he saw a body floating in the river. She only wore one nylon, a black boot, and a string of pearls. A navy blue cape was found nearby. Sheriff's deputies arrived at the crime scene, finding several other pieces of evidence. They quickly identified the woman as Joette Marie Smith. She was 33 and the owner of a popular local restaurant called Buffalo Gals. Joette was described as a remarkable woman, very hospitable, happy, cordial, a woman just full of vigor. She was always there when people needed her. She was last seen on March 27, 1983. Joette closed up the restaurant and went across the street to her studio apartment, which she was sharing with a friend, Rachel Devereaux, at the time. Rachel would stay and work with Joette in the winter months, as her 46-acre property would be inaccessible during the winter rainy season. The two women watched the TV show Thunderbirds and ate some popcorn before Joette made some phone calls. Joette said she was tired, and Rachel went to bed. Rachel woke up at 3 a.m. to find Joette not in the apartment. This was common, as Joette often went to the restaurant late at night. Detectives would find out that Joette had left the apartment and walked to a local bar to buy cigarettes. She had tried one shop closer to home, but it was closed, so she had walked to Henfling's Inn, a bar in downtown Ben Lomond. A waitress there who knew Joette had offered her a ride home, but she had said it was a lovely night, and she wanted to walk. That would be the last known sighting of Joette alive. Detectives believe she might have been stopped on the bridge, which was on her way back home. An autopsy would show that she had been strangled to death and that there may have been a sexual element. Her death was ruled a homicide. There was not much for authorities to go on. They interviewed everyone in Joette's life, talked to people who saw her that night, and came up with nothing. Everyone they spoke to didn't think that Joette had any enemies. Authorities had physical evidence, but nothing to compare it to. And DNA testing was not being used yet. Joette had moved to Ben Lomond 10 years before, and had been about to celebrate the 8th anniversary of owning the restaurant, and she had been planning a big anniversary celebration. She had moved from Colorado Springs but had attended college in Kansas. She was originally from Omaha, Nebraska, where her family still resided. Her mother brought her remains back to Nebraska, where she now rests. There would be no leads in her case till 1988, when detectives would have a suspect. A man named Eric David Drummond. He had an extensive criminal history in California and Nevada, which included sexual assault. Detectives would learn that Drummond had asked Joette out on a date, and she told him no. Drummond had left California quickly after the murder. They had circumstantial evidence connecting him to the crime, but no case could be brought against him without more physical evidence. Joette's case would eventually go cold. In 2022, her case was reopened in the hopes of using new DNA technology not available in 1983. They were able to get a male DNA sample from the 1983 evidence. In August of 2022, they were able to get a sample of DNA directly from Drummond, now 64 years old. The DNA sample was an exact match for the evidence sample. Unfortunately, while detectives were working on getting an arrest warrant, Drummond committed suicide in September. Though there will not be justice, the friends and family of Joette now have answers. They have also input Drummond's DNA into Cody's, and are looking to determine if there are any other cold cases that are linked back to him. Joette's sister said in a statement to the media, "A long time ago, I just came to the fact that they probably would never identify her killer. The announcement was a little bit of a letdown, but I don't feel like we didn't get justice. The DNA was a match, and it's closure." A cold case is finally solved nearly 34 years after a young woman was murdered. The FBI has been working with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation to use new technology to finally bring the family of Stacey Lynn Chahorski some peace. This is a historic case. The FBI said this is the first time in the country when both the victim and the killer have been identified by forensic genealogy. Special Agent Joe Montgomery worked on Stacey's case without knowing her name or identity for nearly a decade. He had an old photo of her in black and white, and all this time, he was trying to fill in the blanks. To me, it's incredible, because as an agent, you live with these cases, he said. Stacey was 19 years old when she went missing. A body was found in December 1988, but law enforcement weren't able to identify it. In 2005, the DNA was entered as a Jane Doe into the missing persons database. In 2015, her murder was assigned to the Cold Case Unit. In March of 2022, Agent Montgomery finally got to call Stacey's family and tell them she had been identified through forensic genealogy nearly 34 years after her death. In August 2022, her killer was identified the same way. I spoke to Stacey's mother last week to let her know who the killer was, and she, of course, got really upset, he said. Law enforcement identified the killer as Henry Frederick Wise, who went by Haas and drove a truck all over the Southeast. He also worked as a stunt driver in South Carolina. He was killed in a stunt accident at Myrtle Beach Speedway in 1999 and burned to death, Montgomery said. Wise died before he could face justice for killing Stacey. He died 23 years before Stacey was ever identified. It was traced back. Wise had a living relative who was interviewed, cooperated, and it was matched to Wise, FBI special agent in charge. Kiri Farley said, "Forensic genealogy uses the DNA from the suspect, or the victim's living relatives, but Agent Montgomery said it takes investigators to make the connections. It's like another lead to run down. It develops a profile, but then you have to go through different relatives, and it's almost like a tree. And you're working your way back to the trunk," Agent Montgomery said. In this case, he said the limbs of that tree lead back to Henry Haas Wise and Stacey Chahorski. They created this photograph. It just sits and sits and sits. And then when something comes through, it's like, wow. It's just really overwhelming. DNA from coffee cup solves 1975 cold case murder of 19-year-old Lindy Sue Biechler. In July 2022, one of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania's oldest cold cases was solved when David Sinopoli, 68, was arrested for the brutal murder of Lindy Sue Biechler. Lindy was only 19 years old when she was found stabbed to death in her apartment home in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, on December 5, 1975. She had been sexually assaulted before being stabbed 19 times in her chest, back, and neck. The young girl also had defensive wounds, showing she fought hard for her life. The knife was still in her neck when she was found. Police worked diligently on the case. They interviewed as many as 300 people, consulted crime experts, and launched a task force. However, the crime went unsolved for nearly 5 decades. On July 18, 2022, Lancaster County District Attorney Heather Adams announced that a suspect had finally been arrested for Biechler's brutal murder. David Vincent Sinopoli, 68, of East Hempfield Township, Pennsylvania, was charged with criminal homicide. "We are here today due to advances in DNA technology," said Adams. The cold case one was the oldest unsolved ones in the county, and after all those years, a discarded coffee cup helped lead to the arrest. Using DNA evidence collected from the crime scene, genetic genealogist Cece Moore of Parabon Nanolabs determined that Biechler's murderer likely had ancestors from Gasparina, a small town in Italy. Moore then cross-referenced that data with family trees from Lancaster County, and this led her to Sinopoli, who was still living in the same county. Once Sinopoli was on the investigators' radar, authorities started surveilling him for months. When they spotted Sinopoli tossing out a coffee cup at the Philadelphia International Airport, they retrieved it for DNA testing. His DNA was then tested, and it matched the DNA that was found in the victim's underwear. Sinopoli had lived in the same 4-unit building as Lindy. No other known connection between Lindy and the alleged killer has been reported. Sinopoli was arrested at 7 a.m. on July 17, 2022, at his Pennsylvania home. He is now in custody and is being held without bail at Lancaster County Prison. Lindy Sue Biechler was 19 when her life was brutally taken away from her 46 years ago in the sanctity of her own home. The arrest of David Sinopoli marks the beginning of the court process, and we hope that it brings some sense of relief to the victim's loved ones and to the community, who for the past 47 years have had no answers. The family members of Ronald Cates, a man accused of killing his friend in Orlando in 1992, came forward to law enforcement to help solve the Orange County cold case. Investigators announced during a news conference exactly 30 years to the date of the crime. During the early morning hours of August 10, 1992, deputies responded to a home on North Forsyth Road after the wife of 53-year-old John Stagner found him beaten to death in his bed. Orange County Sheriff John Mina said he had head and facial trauma. Investigators said Stagner was a hard-working maintenance employee for Orange County and was living on the county's maintenance property at the time of his death. The sheriff's office had suspected Cates, who had been a person of interest from the start, committed the crime. But Mina told reporters they didn't have probable cause to make an arrest. Cates reportedly had a drug habit at the time and would often borrow several power tools from Stagner and pawn them to buy drugs. Stagner had reportedly confronted him about it and asked him to return the tools. On the day of the murder, detectives went to his house to speak with him about the case, but he reportedly had his daughter lie and say he wasn't home. Investigators later learned he was hiding under the home that day. They spoke to Cates the following day, and again on August 18, 1992, and said there were inconsistencies in the timeline he gave and what his family members were saying. The case kept going, and in 1995, there was a suicidal incident where Cates reportedly admitted to his family that he killed Stagner, the sheriff's office said. But because of how evidence and technology was at the time, there wasn't enough to charge Cates. In 2020, a family member of Cates contacted Orange County Sheriff's Office about the cold case. The family really cared about this case, even if they were the suspect's family, because Mr. Stagner was very, very good to the Cates family. He would give them money at the time when they needed it or a place to stay. Detective Kevin Wilson stated. Detectives started looking into the case some more and spoke to Cates' daughter and wife, and in March 2022, they began more extensive interviews with family members. Wilson said, "They were in fear of Mr. Cates their whole lives because he was very abusive to them, and they were in fear of him." In April 2022, Cates, who was in a hospital in North Carolina, allegedly told a nurse he had killed someone in Florida in 1992. Orange County Sheriff's Office said she then told a security guard. And they did research and found the 1992 case on the Sheriff's Office's website. Officers with the Salisbury Police Department in North Carolina responded to the hospital and obtained Cates' confession on body camera video. The Sheriff's Office said Cates didn't explain the motive of the murder during his confession. He just explained more or less that he hit Johnny with a stick, Wilson said. Cates reportedly used a walking stick to get around, according to his family, and the stick was found at the crime scene. Detectives said there was enough evidence at that point to be able to interview Cates again and charge him with Stagner's murder. Cates was arrested on August 5th on a first-degree murder charge and is being held in a North Carolina jail, awaiting extradition to Florida. Mina said the sheriff's office started its cold case team in 2020, and since then, the team has solved 13 cases dating back to 1984. After Captain James Tappen Hall was shot to death in Rockville, Maryland in 1971, the mysterious killing remained unsolved for decades. Now, over 50 years later, officers where he worked say they finally nabbed his killer. Larry David Smith, formerly known as Larry David Becker, 71, was a person of interest from nearly the beginning of the half-century-long quest for justice. He now stands accused, formally of murder, and allegedly confessed to the crime in early September of 2022. Hall was a special deputy sheriff for Montgomery County and is believed to have interrupted a burglary already in progress. At approximately 10:40 p.m. on Saturday, October 23rd, witnesses entered the Manor Country Club in the 1400 block of Carrollton Road and reported that there was a man lying face down in the southeast parking lot with trauma to his head, the Montgomery County Police Department wrote in a press release last year. Police and fire rescue responded and discovered Captain Hall suffering from a gunshot wound to his head. The victim succumbed to his injuries 3 days later. Becker was initially interviewed by investigators in 1973, but was not officially named as a suspect. Time passed, the case went cold, the file was shelved, and the questions lingered for decades. In October of 2021, the department reopened the case, terming it an ongoing homicide investigation. Those renewed efforts allegedly bore fruit. For almost a year, Detective Leggett and Corporal Killen of the Cold Case Unit combed through case files, recordings, and interviewed witnesses, the Montgomery County Police Department said in a recent press release. Through the course of their investigation, Leggett and Killen narrowed in on one person, Larry David Becker. According to the police department, the cold case investigators learned that Becker began using the last name Smith in 1975 and moved to upstate New York, where he had been living for over 45 years. And after learning that information, it was off to the races. On September 1st, 2022, Leggett and Killen interviewed Smith in the Empire State. During that interview, the suspect allegedly confessed to shooting Hall. Later that same day, the detectives applied for and received an arrest warrant that charged Smith with Hall's murder. Smith subsequently waived extradition and will likely be back in Maryland by the end of the September 2022, police said. During a press conference, Montgomery County officials from various agencies praised the detectives' work. They have been dedicated and committed to finding justice, Chief Marcus Jones said. We have never shown that we have given up on finding justice for this case. They have persevered in a manner that demonstrates the high quality of Montgomery County Police. To obtain a confession for someone who committed a crime 51 years ago is a tremendous, tremendous accomplishment, the chief went on to say. And though the lone suspect is currently charged and in custody, the Montgomery County Police Department says the case is an ongoing investigation and are still asking for the public's help with any additional relevant details. The apparent solving of Hall's murder is the oldest cold case the department has closed. Lieutenant Kenneth Sanger of the department's Major Crimes Division said the case will now be handed over to the state attorney's office, who intends to take it across the finish line. If you enjoyed the video, please show your support by subscribing and liking the video, and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any future uploads.